Good afternoon. Welcome to the Farm for Change lecture on nature-based solutions. My name is Qianyi Lu. I'm research fellow here at the Institute of European and American Studies, Academia Sinica. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Simon Counsell. Simon is an independent researcher working on nature-based solutions, carbon offsetting, and rights-based conservation. He is advisor to the human rights group Survival International and the former director of Rainforest Foundation UK. He has been on the front line of campaigns to protect the world's forests and the lives and livelihoods of rainforest peoples for over 3 decades. His work has taken him to the forests of the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and West Africa. Prior to his work at the Rainforest Foundation, he also worked for Friends of the Earth. Simon has written extensively on nature-based solutions. To me, the concept of nature-based solutions is relatively new. When I was educating myself about this nature-based solutions, Simon's name kept popping up everywhere in different newspaper articles, NGO studies, and podcast interviews. So for sure, he is very knowledgeable about nature-based solutions. And Simon will be talking for roughly 40 minutes, 40, 50 minutes. We want to leave more time for Q&A. So Simon, the floor is yours. Oh, and I really appreciate you getting up so early. It's 7 o'clock in Switzerland where Simon is.
Well, thank you very much, Jinyi. And it's really a privilege to be invited to speak with you this afternoon about this. I hope you can all hear me okay. Maybe someone can wave a hand at me if there's an issue with the sound, but it's all good. Okay, so just to give you an outline of what I'm going to talk about. Firstly, I'll explain quickly what we mean by nature-based solutions. Then I'll look at some of the in principle problems with the concept. Then look at the way that nature-based solutions are being implemented in practice, which is principally through the mechanism of carbon trading. And then give an example that you may have heard of actually, as it relates to the CPC Corporation and its involvement in nature-based solutions, and then just conclude with a few remarks. So, excuse me. So just to understand what we mean by nature-based solutions, and can I get my presentation up here? Gone. Can you see my presentation? Or
Yes, it's not playing yet.
okay. Sorry.
See it.
Okay, how's that?
Good, good.
You're good. Okay, so this nature-based solutions is a term we often hear. It's moving into the center of discussions about climate change and protecting the world's biodiversity. It's often posed as a dual benefit and a dual solution to both of these global environmental problems. The term first appeared in around 2009, so it's about 13, 14 years old, and it was devised principally by international conservation organizations who realized that the carbon stored in the protected areas they're responsible for, the national parks and wildlife reserves and so on, could be worth billions of dollars if commoditized and sold as carbon credits to polluting industries. Conservation organizations, the conservation industry as a whole, always seeks to get more money, so this seemed like a relatively good idea. What does it mean exactly? Well, here's a definition that was devised by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 2016. That's the global body, intergovernmental body that deals with the conservation of the world's natural resources, nature. So it says nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Well, that sounds pretty good. What could be wrong with it? It's actually so broad as to basically mean anything involving living organisms that brings benefits to both nature and humans. Excuse me. And when we think about it, actually, people the world over have always sought and deployed nature-based solutions, especially those in rural and subsistence economies, and that's most of the world's people for most of history, actually. So in a sense, there's nothing particularly new about this concept. In practice, though, the term has come to have a more limited meaning, and it refers to mechanisms for mitigating or adapting to climate change, which involve living things. And it's often used interchangeably with a similar term, these natural climate solutions. So again, this is based on the simple and kind of superficially benign idea that nature and natural ecosystems can help fight climate change, principally by sucking atmosphere warming carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it where it can do no harm. We know, for example, that trees store a lot of carbon in their trunks and branches, as do other ecosystems like peat bogs and some other forms of soils. In fact, ecosystems, including forest, the soil, oceans, and wetlands, are and always have been an integral and hugely important part of the planet's natural carbon cycles, absorbing, storing, and periodically releasing carbon to the atmosphere. What's new about the concept, though, is that it posits that deliberate interventions in the biosphere, so the living part of the planet, can now make a major contribution to preventing climate change. This has been seized on by polluting industries such as oil companies and by some governments because it appears to offer an alternative to having to rapidly reduce fossil fuel use, which of course is politically and economically challenging. Many oil companies now claim they're becoming carbon net neutral by offsetting at least some of their carbon emissions by planting trees or buying carbon credits from people who are protecting forests. I'll come back to this a little later and give an example of such a solution, which, as I said, has been used by CPC. For now, though, you can ponder on how a fossil fuel, such as a liquefied natural gas or LNG, could be carbon neutral, as was claimed in this newspaper article from 3 years ago. But back to the theory. So one influential study in 2017 claimed to show that as much as 37% of global carbon emissions up to 2030 could be mitigated through these so-called natural climate solutions. And this claim was repeated endlessly by prominent political leaders, UN agencies, and global business groups such as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So this would mean potentially more than a third of the climate problem could be dealt with just by doing something better with trees and all these natural ecosystems, if it were true. And the problem is that it isn't true, and I will explain why. So it's certainly true that as yet, by far the most effective way of sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is indeed by planting trees. It's the only way we've actually got to get carbon out of the atmosphere at any scale. And by planting trees is in fact accounts for about a half or nearly half, of the claimed mitigation potential for these so-called natural climate solutions. I don't know how clear this graph is, but the big dark green part of the chart there shows the percentage of carbon dioxide climate mitigation that can be achieved by planting trees. But it turns out, though, that in order to achieve this huge, we're talking about somewhere between 10, 14, 15 billion tons of carbon dioxide, in theory, could be removed from the atmosphere. It turns out in order to do so, vast new areas of forest would have to be planted. Actually, at least the size of Australia. The estimates vary. Some people say twice the size of Australia, but whatever we know, it's continental-sized areas of new plantings of trees would have to be established. Of course, we can't cover the whole of Australia in trees. Indeed, there is, in fact, nowhere on Earth where such a large unused area could be afforested, replanted, or newly planted with trees. This scale of land could only, in fact, be found by planting on existing farmland. And the global scientific body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has estimated that this could result in up to 300 million people worldwide becoming malnourished, with the price of food globally increasing by about 80%. So this is potentially a major take of land with major impacts on human well-being if we were to try and go down this route. In order to capture carbon quickly, these forests would need not to be the usual slow-growing kind of native types of trees that we might see and hope for, but in fact, vast monocultures of fast-growing species like eucalyptus, as we see in this photograph here, or acacia trees, usually planted in areas where they're not at all native, and again, of course, can have a major requirement for inputs of fertilizers and pesticides, machinery, and so on and so forth. And they are, in fact, a disaster for wildlife and can replace important ecosystems such as savannas. So the second, most of the rest of the nature-based solution climate mitigation potential would be achieved under this claim of 37% of mitigation by 2030, would be achieved by almost instantaneously stopping deforestation globally and ensuring that all the wood we use throughout the world comes from areas of forest being sustainably managed. Now, let's be clear, these would clearly be good things to achieve, but the problem is that there is no way this can be done globally within a few years or even a decade. Now, I've been working in this field for nearly 40 years, actually, and despite the multiple global agreements about preventing deforestation, huge funding programs, and continued high-level restatement of political commitment to reduce deforestation, the rates of global loss of forests have actually barely shifted at all. We're still losing millions of hectares of forest globally each year, mostly in the poor countries, and we're largely still producing timber unsustainably. And in my view, as long as the underlying causes of this remain in place, and by this I mean inequitable land tenure, again, mostly in poor countries, overconsumption of commodities such as soya and beef, which tend to replace natural forests throughout the world, out of control multinational corporations, badly planned infrastructure like roads and oil pipelines and hydroelectric dams and so on, all of which contribute to deforestation, and lack of good land use planning, we'll certainly carry on losing forests into the future, especially again in poor countries. A third major problem with nature-based solutions, and especially this claim that they can deal with more than a third of climate mitigation, is that precisely because of climate change, ecosystems like forests are becoming much less good at storing carbon. Indeed, we've seen in the last few years catastrophic fires sending a lot more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, including from places where fires have never occurred before. So the carbon stored in these natural ecosystems is in fact fast moving into the atmosphere and contributing to climate change. So under the theory of nature-based solutions, these very ecosystems that are supposed to help are in fact becoming a bigger part of the problem in reality. According to my calculations, if we rule out all of these so-called nature-based solutions, such as these vast areas of afforestation, planting of trees where there isn't actually any room for them, all the solutions that are not actually feasible in the real world, that don't damage the environment further, and do not require the eviction of millions of people from their land, I believe that such solutions could probably only account for a very small part of climate change mitigation, perhaps a few percent by 2030. It's worth noting actually that we're now roughly 6 years on from when this 37% mitigation claim was made, with only 7 more years to go to 2030. And nature-based solutions have essentially contributed nothing yet to the mitigation of climate change. And my view is that, you know, to prevent this third of climate change through nature-based solutions is in fact completely misleading and unachievable. You know, it distracts us very much from the overwhelming need to reduce carbon emissions from fossil fuel consumption. And actually, the pursuit of nature-based solutions at this kind of scale, if it distracts us from this overwhelming priority, could be catastrophic in terms of trying to prevent climate change. But that has actually not stopped nature-based solutions from becoming a key part of the response of some of those most responsible for climate change, especially the large fossil fuel companies, airlines, and other heavily polluting industries. And as I mentioned earlier, this is mainly taking place through the mechanism of carbon offsetting or compensation. And again, just to explain this, it's a simple theory that instead of, say, you know, taking the expensive and technically difficult measures to prevent carbon dioxide coming out of the power station chimney or wherever, companies running the power stations instead pay someone else somewhere else to either reduce an equivalent amount of pollution or to do something like planting trees that will notionally capture the same amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it, as shown in this diagram here. The companies pay, someone plants the trees, the carbon dioxide from the factories in theory gets absorbed into the trees and stays there. So it's kind of carbon neutralized them. And those running the projects to, say, plant the trees or, say, protect the forest from destruction can, through a fairly complicated process, actually add up the additional amounts of carbon they are storing and sell those on the open markets as carbon credits. A typical unit of a carbon credit is 1 ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent. And they can be sold for anywhere between $1 and maybe $30 or $40 in the very best cases. In order to be sellable, carbon offset projects and the carbon credits they generate really have to be produced using an approved methodology of one of the various voluntary schemes in existence and independently audited. Governments, governments very much like this neoliberal approach to climate mitigation because it means they have to do less or no actual regulation of polluting industries. They can just leave it to the markets to sort it out. And the largest of these voluntary schemes, responsible for the oversight of production of the carbon credits, the verification of them, that's the certification of them as supposedly representing genuine carbon reduction somewhere, called Vera, which was established by business groups, including the World Business Council for Sustainable Development back in 2007, recently issued its billionth verified carbon credit. And just to put that in scale, that's about 4 years worth of all the carbon emissions from Taiwan. So I mean, this is quite a large and growing industry, and is set to become potentially much bigger in the coming years. Before I look at how these kinds of carbon offset projects look like in practice, it's really necessary to understand a few of the basic principles that have always broadly been agreed should apply to carbon offsetting projects. And the first of these is this concept of additionality. Would this project and these supposed carbon emissions have happened without the intervention of the carbon market? To understand this, think of a patch of forest somewhere, let's say in Africa. As a carbon offset project developer, we could say that this forest is threatened with destruction. And by halting its destruction, we can prevent, say, 10 million tons of carbon dioxide being released to the atmosphere. Then we can sell 10 million tons of carbon credits to a polluting industry, profiting us by maybe $50 million, some of which we'll invest back into protecting the forest. But supposing the forest is already designated as a strictly protected area, say a national park, is there anything we can do that's additional to this existing legal protection by selling the carbon credits? Probably not. Therefore, we can't really claim that the forest will be destroyed without our carbon money, and therefore we can't really claim any carbon credits here. Whether an offset project offers genuinely new and additional carbon saving is not always so black and white, actually, but it's a very basic requirement. It has to be new and additional to qualify for the generation of carbon credits. And the next bit, and bear with me here because this gets a little bit complicated, but I'll try and explain as best I can. In order to claim a certain amount of carbon credits, we have to know how much carbon is being emitted from our project area presently, and that's relatively straightforward to do. But the much harder part is we have to then compare that with how much carbon we think would have been emitted had the project not existed. So let's assume our example forest somewhere in Africa is not already designated as legally protected, so we could say our project is additional. So if we can protect it, we can generate some genuine additional carbon savings. But we'd have to somehow show what we think would happen in the next 20 or 30 years in the future. Who would destroy the forest if the project did not exist? How? Why? How much forest? Of course, this is fundamentally problematic because no one can travel into the future to find out what would happen without our project. And it's particularly problematic with these nature-based solutions because the factors that affect the way that land, forests, and soils and so on are affected are typically extremely complex, and they tend to change rapidly over time. They're a result of governmental development policies, of land planning policies, of demography, of economic factors, of agricultural commodity trends and so on. So it's very, very hard to know with any precision what will happen to our forest in Africa, say in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time. And this is one of the greatest areas where false carbon credits, we often call them hot air credits because they don't represent anything other than kind of hot air in a sense, can be generated from nature-based solutions. And I'll just try and give you an example here to explain this a little bit. So this graph here shows the deforestation rate in our forest in Africa, let's say. So the top blue line there, let's say it's 1% of our forest is being deforested every year. You'll see that after 20 years, 20% of the forest has gone. So everything under that blue line represents deforestation, and it will represent carbon emissions. Supposing our project, however, can reduce that deforestation to 0.5% per year, you'll see that we've still got more forest left at the we had less deforestation after the 20 years of the project, say, and the gap between what would have happened without the project and what actually happens with the project is essentially determines the amount of carbon credits that are generated from this project. I hope that that's relatively clear. Supposing, however, we say that, all right, so the existing rate of deforestation is 1%, but we think it could increase to 2% per year because of whatever factors we say will cause an increase in deforestation. So what then, but by doing this, we've then vastly increased the number of carbon credits that the project can generate just by this one very, very simple and very difficult to disprove recalculation or projection, let's say, of how much deforestation is going to happen here. And what you can actually see from this is that the actual rate of deforestation, which I show here with this orange dotted line, can increase above the present rate of deforestation, but we would still generate carbon credits because we're still, even though the real rate of deforestation has increased, it's still less than the theoretical projected level of deforestation. So actual deforestation, actual emissions of carbon dioxide have increased, but we're still gaining carbon credits from this project through this one simple statistical manipulation. And this is actually a very common problem with these kinds of projects. And in fact, there have been some studies produced recently, and this has gained some media coverage internationally, that something like 90% of all these kinds of projects which claim to be saving forests, or in some cases planting new forests, suffer from this kind of problem of what's called inflated baselines. The carbon credits generated by these projects are really just a projection, a result of projecting a much worse future than would have actually occurred. So, so some of the other problems that we have with these nature-based solutions in the carbon trading mechanism. Well, there's one called leakage, a very fundamental issue, and that's, well, look, so we can protect our forest in Africa, say, and we can prevent that from being cut down and carbon dioxide being emitted. But supposing that just causes the problem to move somewhere else, whoever we stopped from destroying the forest simply went to another area and cut that down instead for farmland or whatever it might be. The net result, if that happens, is exactly the same amount of carbon released to the atmosphere. Hence, again, we can't really claim any carbon credits because there's been no net beneficial effect for the atmosphere. Again, this is a very widespread problem with nature-based solutions. Again, it's extremely hard to detect in any meaningful way because the causes of deforestation, I mean, they can be national and international. If a palm oil company, for example, doesn't want to destroy or can't destroy a forest in Indonesia, it might simply move to Malaysia to destroy a forest there to plant its palm oil plantation. So again, a major problem at a fundamental level with this approach to climate mitigation. And finally, permanence. So we know that to all intents and purposes, the carbon that's being emitted to the atmosphere from fossil fuels is therefore, well, in perpetuity, forever, essentially. It's hundreds and possibly thousands of years. So that's how long it's going to stay in the atmosphere. So to compensate for those kinds of carbon emissions, in principle, the carbon that we're preventing from being emitted, or the carbon that we're storing in new trees, for example, that's also got to be there more or less in perpetuity, permanently. And again, if we can't guarantee that, then we can't really sell our carbon credits. It's no good planting a forest of trees and then cutting it down or burning it in 10 or 20 years, because we still end up with extra carbon in the atmosphere. And again, you know, as I said earlier, one of the problems with nature-based solutions is that all carbon in natural organisms is inherently impermanent. It can and it does revert back into the atmosphere very readily, often by fire or the death of the organism, decomposition, and so on. So there's an inherent kind of proneness, if you like, to impermanence with nature-based solutions. So those are some of the kind of theoretical, in principle, problems with this kind of approach to climate change. But let's get back to this example that I showed earlier. So in 2019, CPC bought nearly 190,000 carbon credits from a supposedly forest saving project in Peru. It's also more recently bought shipments of supposedly carbon neutral liquid natural gas from Shell and Chevron, which involved the purchase of nearly 400,000 carbon credits from offset projects in Cambodia, Indonesia, and Nepal. Last year, I scrutinized the offset project in Peru, and here briefly is what I found. So this project is called the Cordillera Azul National Park, which covers about 13,000 square kilometers in Peru. That's about a third of the size of Taiwan. It's covered in dense tropical Amazonian rainforest, as you see in the picture here, a very beautiful area. And a lot of it is mountainous and very inaccessible. The project was validated as a carbon offset project under the Vera scheme in 2013. And the proposition of this project is that without selling carbon offsets, the area would have been overwhelmed, cut down and burned by poor Peruvians seeking land on which to grow crops. I mean, this is indeed, something which has been going on extensively in that part of the world for several decades. And the project claims that by protecting the area, it would, in its first 10 years of operation, prevent nearly 16 million tons of carbon being emitted to the atmosphere. To date, the project has now been going for 13, 14 years. It has sold around 25 million credits, including those to CPC. But when we start to look a bit closer, problems start to emerge. Let's go back to our criteria for supposedly credible carbon offset projects. So the first question, was this project really additional? And the answer is probably not. In fact, 4 or 5 years before the carbon project even started, the area had already been designated as a national park and was thus protected. In fact, documentation that I have obtained show that it was claimed that the very limited deforestation that was occurring within this area was pretty quickly stamped out before the project became a carbon project. So it's hard to see exactly how this project brought any new and additional carbon savings that hadn't already been brought into effect by the creation of this national park years before the carbon project even started. The baselines, as we say, this kind of projection into the future of what would have happened in the absence of the project. Well, it got very complicated actually looking at this, but what I found was that the project projected huge rates of deforestation. I mentioned earlier on these figures of maybe 1%. You could inflate that to 2% and create a lot more carbon credits. In fact, in this project, the projected deforestation rates went up to like 4 or 5% per year, something like that. So extremely high from a baseline of almost zero, actually. And a lot of this was based on projected population growth in this area of unheard of proportions, like 20% per year compound growth of population in this area. So these are all purely statistical manipulations to make it look as if the future of this area would have been extremely bleak had the project not been there to supposedly prevent all this deforestation from happening. Leakage, well, did the deforestation simply move elsewhere instead of in this project? Well, almost certainly, actually, because as I mentioned, there's been a very big trend of people migrating into this part of the Peruvian Amazon and seeking farmland, which has been going on for decades. And what was actually happening, and one can see this from satellite images, is that people were not clearing forest inside this national park anymore, but they were clearing it right next door to it and all around it, in fact. And there's no particular reason to think that because the project can't kind of act outside its own boundaries, it was actually doing nothing to stop this wider process of deforestation happening. So in this case, my guess is that the leakage of carbon emissions from this project area to just simply somewhere else was probably extremely high, probably about 100% actually. And the permanence, well, as I said, the carbon stored in trees is never really permanent. It can burn down at any time, re-releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere, and that is potentially a particular problem in this area because it's one of the parts of the world that is projected will become hotter and drier faster than anywhere else. So that the danger of major forest fires here is growing as climate change intensifies. So my conclusion about this offset project is that the carbon credits generated from it are essentially fictitious. They don't in any sense represent real reductions in emissions that could be used to compensate for CPCs or its customers' burning of gas, or indeed any other companies' carbon emissions. And I should emphasize that these kinds of problems are not unique to the credits bought by the CPC, nor of this project. I've analysed many such projects, and most of them face similar failings. I've compared different systems and methods of producing these so-called nature-based carbon offsets, and they all face these intractable problems. In fact, the entire market-based method for dealing with climate changing emissions like this simply doesn't work. Now, that's fortunately starting to gain a lot more public attention over the last months or so, last couple of years perhaps, as some of these media headlines attest. The Die Zeit newspaper in Germany has been really leading the kind of expose of this major problem. But the carbon market and carbon offsets remain entirely unregulated. No one is ultimately accountable for the sale of these phony, fake carbon credits, though the climate certainly feels the impact from them. And under the global climate policies set up under the Paris Agreement through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, carbon trading could in fact move to center stage, with these kinds of credits being bought and sold to offset entire nations' emissions, not just specific companies and individuals. And I think if this becomes the case, and if the mechanisms for dealing with this or creating these global carbon markets are under discussion right now, and they could be rolled into operation slowly, probably at first, later this year or beginning of next year. I honestly think that it will be the last kind of stage in losing the battle against climate change, because we'd be implementing a solution that simply isn't and hasn't worked in the past. So my view is it's time to call time on carbon trading, and it's also time for me to finish. So I thank you very much for listening, and I think we have plenty of time for questions and answers now.
Thank you so much, Simon. If you have in the audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. There is a hand sign at the left bottom of the screen. Or you can also maybe turn on your screen, your video, to show your face, so I'll know. And meanwhile, meanwhile, I'll ask a kind of a broad question. This is also a question that a friend, a professor working on nature-based solution, she sent an email. Does that mean that we should, in general, just reject the idea of nature-based solutions? Is it the general attitude we should have? Is there anything good about nature-based solutions? Is it possible that nature-based solution is a good thing, but it's implemented wrongly or something like that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm asked this quite often. I mean, yes, I mean for sure there are many nature-based solutions which are, you know, they're very worthy things to do. They're good things to do for the planet, and as I say, that can range from increasing the amount of trees in cities. It can involve using natural flood prevention measures with things like mangrove forests and so on and so forth. There's many different ways, improving agricultural practices in some areas, reintroducing biodiversity back into agricultural systems. So these will all be generally good things. So in a sense, the whole concept of nature-based solutions shouldn't really be rejected in that sense. The issue is, though, that the idea has now become so co-opted and subverted that it is predominantly being used as a mechanism for greenwashing, these kind of carbon offsetting and other kinds of projects that I've been talking about. So it's become a very debased concept. You know, someone's pointed out that most of these other things that I mentioned that are good forms of nature-based solutions and controlled by local people and indigenous peoples and so on, they already have kind of existing names. I mean, there's the term agroecology, for example, to describe more diverse forms of farming and so on. We don't need to use this now debased term of nature-based solutions, I think. And so my preference would be basically to stop using it, because it is principally just a mechanism for greenwashing. Now, people say, you know, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we say this one. I think the problem is that there's very, very little baby in there and an awful lot of bathwater. So that would be my response to it.
Okay, is there any questions from the audience? Okay, if not, I have more questions. The dire picture, you talked about the global elite, probably also financial elite. They are building this global carbon market, and you said it'll be kind of the end of our struggle to save the planet. So the first part of my question is, to what extent is the financial market, the financial world, driving this nature-based solution? And given that dire picture that you've painted, what can we do? Because they are elite, they are up there, they are so distant from us. There seems nothing we can do to stop them. It doesn't sound like there's anything we can do to stop them. If that's what they want, they want to build this global market, they'll do it, whether or not we want it or not. And the last part of my question is, I've been asked this question. A lot of young people, because this nature-based solution has already created a lot of jobs or subjects for studies or research. It's actually already interwoven into people's career, or especially young people. So to people who have devoted their belief, their energies, their intellectual efforts to nature-based solutions, you can imagine it's very frustrating for them to listen to your talk.
Mm.
But to young people like
Mm.
these, what's your suggestions? What can you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, two extremely good points. Yes, I mean on the financial elites and so on, and their role in this concept. Yes, it's absolutely true. And you know what happened, especially at the beginning of COVID and kind of into that kind of early period of the pandemic, is that this concept of nature-based solutions really grew extremely rapidly. I mean, it had been there kind of knocking around the global, you know, negotiations and amongst policymakers and so on. And the way that it was presented actually by, you know, bankers, project developers and so on was that, you know, it's a form of it rests on a form of commodification of nature. And you know, with the global collapse of asset values in 2020, um, there was a concerted effort, and you know, the World Economic Forum was very much involved in this and heavily promoting this, of seeing nature as the new asset class, you know, along with kind of property and stocks and shares and bonds and all those kinds of things. And you know they produce calculations and some of the kind of conservation organizations that like to kind of place a value on nature, you know, they come up with figures that nature is worth $700 trillion. Now, I mean, not all of nature's going to get commodified in that sense and traded, you know, bought and sold for its carbon or its biodiversity or other content, but you know, you only have to have a you know relatively small proportion of that in trade, and traders are going to make money from it. You know, it's not the asset itself that's so important; it's the trading of the asset. So yes, I mean, so then this has already created you know very large markets and very large expectations. In fact, that this trading in natural assets is you know is progressively creating an entirely new asset class actually. I mean, there's the New York Stock Exchange has been developing a thing called natural asset companies, which could be traded on the stock exchange within months. Actually, it's well in the process of being developed. So these are companies that are specifically designed to trade, commodify value, and trade in the values of natural assets like forests and grasslands and whatever it might be. Even you know single species are being kind of valued, and the value of them being traded. Um, so yes, that there has definitely been a role being played and heavily promoted. What can we do about that? Well, you know, it always can seem a little disempowering when you hear this, but you know, for this to really gain traction, I think it has to become it would have to become a part of the global climate and biodiversity frameworks. Now we're still a way off that. Actually, it's probably closest in terms of the climate change and the, as I say, these carbon trades, carbon credits, if you like, being agreed within the UN system. And they've not been rejected from the UN system ever, actually, but there's never been an agreed mechanism for how they can be traded between countries. But that will be a consensus decision. You know, every single country that's a member of the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change has a say in that, and virtually in any of the countries in there can, in theory, can block it. So there's always a chance that we have to get our governments to stand up to this and recognise the dangers of it. And you know what I do, you know, as basically as an individual now mostly, but working with a few colleagues sometimes and a small network, and we keep emphasising and publicising and exposing how bad some of these carbon trading mechanisms actually are, and the projects that they're based on are just not actually doing anything to prevent climate change. And it will be the same with biodiversity, which can also, in theory, be traded like carbon can. So that one I think is that. Now, for young people getting into this, yes, what's been incredible over the last 4 or 5 years or so is just how quickly this concept of nature-based solutions has developed its own kind of momentum, and it creates these research posts, it creates these posts in financial institutions, in international conservation organizations, all of whom now find that they're actually based, and their income is based on, and their research interests are based on this concept, which, as we say, looks superficially quite good, but underneath it is often very bad. In fact, I think the thing that is really, look carefully at what you're doing. Just stand back a little bit and say, am I actually doing anything that's benefiting the planet here and the rest of humanity? Or is this just something that can actually contribute to making some of the problems worse? These are personal choices, and we just have to reflect on whether we're helping move things in the right direction. Look critically. There is quite a lot of critical analysis around now. Bear that in mind, and yeah, keep an open mind about this, and keep engaging in the debate, basically.
Thank you. I see Chen Yu. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question. So, first of all, thank you for the amazing talk you gave. I do have a question that, so you basically mentioned about the current problem of nature-based solution on climate change mitigation and also on the current carbon trading system. But my question is like, you point out those issues and point out those barriers existing or potentially will harm the current adaptation and mitigation system. But is it impossible to like adjusting or modifying the current system, or even using like regulation or international agreement, something like that, or creating some standard standard that all the international community can be followed? Uh, I'm just a little bit curious about like why just directly lead to a conclusion that the NBA natural-based solution on mitigation is not going to work in the future, even modifying something, or like we should directly ditch the whole carbon system, a carbon trading system which have already exist or already conducting in some of the countries. Thank you.
Yes, good question, good point. So look, so my view on the carbon trading, and this is principally in relation to these nature-based solutions, protecting forests and peatlands and so on and so forth. I don't really have the expertise, because there are carbon offsets where, for example, fossil fuel power stations are being replaced with solar-driven power generation, for example, and so that's a different matter, I think. But so the issue is that, well, I mean, for a start, something else I didn't really say about nature-based solutions, and probably should have done, is that they're almost always slow. Yeah, as I said, trees definitely absorb carbon. We know that for a fact, and it's the only way we know to do it at scale. But it takes a long time. Even kind of fast-growing eucalyptus trees, they're only really absorbing a lot of carbon after what, maybe 10 years, something like that. For more desirable species of tree and for whole kind of ecosystems like peat bogs, it can take decades before there's really much carbon sequestration going on there. And we simply don't have decades to address this problem. The IPCC report that came out a couple of days ago made it very clear that we're down to about 12 years worth of carbon budget now. We don't have time to mess around with kind of desirable maybe, but slow and unreliable systems like nature-based solutions. And as I say, the danger is that even if they can produce in the long term, can produce some good results. We all want more forests around, and we want more biodiverse ecosystems and so on. If they, in the short term, we've just got to stop putting fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them. That's the overwhelming priority. Can the markets be reformed? Well, I mean, in theory, yes, you can, but the problem is that there's nothing. There has been no regulation of these markets in the 15, 16 years that they've existed. And even there's a couple of initiatives going on at the moment, voluntary initiatives kind of within the industry itself to try and improve the kind of credibility and the quality of the carbon credits that are being traded in the market. And they're offering kind of guidelines basically for how things can be improved and so on. But even that, is meeting quite stiff opposition from the carbon industry, and there's big debates about that going on, and we might see some kind of voluntary measures from the industry being started to roll out fairly soon, actually. But I think that's still a very, very long way from the kind of rigorous regulation that I think is going to be needed. And probably on a global basis, because these kind of carbon mechanisms and trading mechanisms and the projects are everywhere. The kind of systems for exchanging the carbon credits are everywhere. The buyers of these carbon credits are everywhere. So it kind of has to be done at a global basis. And as I say, that discussion hasn't even started essentially in the United Nations negotiations, and these things take a long time basically. So again, my feeling is that we're at the moment probably the best is to just stop, pause, and not necessarily end completely, but at least kind of pause. Let's look at what's gone wrong with this carbon market and trading system. See if there's potential to fix it in the time that we've got available, and if so, then to try and do so. Pilot the kind of fixed system at a smaller scale, and then kind of see whether that can be scaled up into something that genuinely serves to mitigate climate change. So that's my kind of response to that. I think we've let it go on to, like climate change itself, actually, we've let it go on too long, where we've now kind of reduced our options a little bit within the time available left to us now.
Okay, I see Xie Yi, but before you speak, I want to say to the audience that if you feel like writing down your question in Chinese, that's okay. In the chat room, that's okay too. So Xie Yi, please go ahead.
Okay. Oops, not sure if everyone can hear me. Okay, thank you for the really excellent talk. I basically agree with everything being said in the lecture. But this whole practice of natural-based solution, it has been, there's a new discourse that's being connected to carbon, of course, but it has been going on for almost like starting from the 70s, when the environmental protect started, and like the cement industries, they started to feel the pressure from the public, and then they started to build parks, build trees or around the actual mines. So what I was trying to say, and also like for almost 2 decades in the environmental communities or activist communities in China, it seems like planting trees are, it's like the least detrimental solution available on the table. So you go around and talking to those activists, they would say like, well, I guess we just keep building trees and planting trees around the desert. So I wonder, like, there's something quite, I'm an anthropologist, so for me, it's like when we link the natural solution alongside carbon trading, we kind of tread into a troubled water of universalizing the idea of nature as if it's equivalent to this carbon that's like, for me, like from the anthropological point of view, nature solution, it should be a nature solution. You know, it's a plural term. Nature means different things to different people from different class background. And so is carbon. The way that carbon trading, its own politics in China, it's drastically different from the politics of carbon trading in Europe, although they have been connected through this global market. But they are different things, concrete things, socially, culturally, politically. So I'm not entirely convinced that we should like put this analogy so quickly, and it's sort of, for me, it I don't know, I'm a little bit worried about. I agree with everything that underlies the greenwash. It's a real problem for carbon. It's trying to, solve the things that's the problems embedded in the carbon trading, and the market economy of it. But again, I'm a bit of, I use naturals now as much as we use musics and photographies. They mean different things to different people. So I'm not sure, like, can we like try to do like a natural solution, or is there a better way to frame this? I would love to hear more of your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, very interesting point, and what one can discuss this at length, because one of the things one comes up against, and you kind of, you rightly identify, is that in this concept of nature-based solutions, nature is being treated as an objective thing. It's something that's separate from humans. We can see there's us here and there's nature there. We can do stuff with nature, and nature will do stuff back for us. Well, I mean, nature isn't that. Nature, it's always been, for long understood that nature is a cultural construct. It's different in every single culture with every different people. And interestingly, some of the people that are living with and in most closely with nature don't even use terms like nature. I'm talking about indigenous peoples living in the forest of the Amazon, the Congo Basin, or wherever. It's already kind of problematic to kind of objectify nature in a sense in that way, because it's what we make of it in a sense. Then you kind of touch on other issues there. I mean, the kind of separation, in a sense, of the carbon values from this kind of entirety of the biosphere is also, fundamentally problematic. I mean, you take the question of trees. Now, if you look at a forest just into carbon value, then you may as well just have that big monoculture of eucalyptus trees, because they have lots of carbon in it. Forests actually have much wider values. So they have cultural values, they have spiritual values, biodiversity values, ecosystem service values, many other kinds of values. So biodiversity as another kind of aspect, or another quality of nature in a sense, is also beginning to come into these kind of tradable systems in the same way, and very much following the model that's being developed for carbon. So in a sense, that represents another set of values, and probably a more important set of values of nature than carbon. But yes, I mean, it's a kind of fundamentally perverse way of kind of valuing and trading this kind of collection of values on just one aspect, the carbon function, and will lead to perverse outcomes for sure. I don't know if that answers your question, but
do we have more questions? Or Coco, do you have a question? Okay, I want to follow up on that discussion that you just had. from the anthropologist, her question, and you also mentioned indigenous people. For us in Taiwan, when we use fossil fuels, the CPC, as in your presentation, you talked about how the CPC purchase carbon credits from Peru. In Taiwan, when we consume energy, we don't usually realize that we are hurting people far away. In your writings, I know you write a lot about human rights, how people, indigenous people or not, who are living in the on the land that's designated for so-called conservation, so-called carbon designated carbon credit places. Those people, their human rights are being severely harmed. And also, I remember it's probably in your writing that the oil companies and powerful elite, they kind of divide and rule. So there will be indigenous people or local people who work with maybe the ruling class. I can't remember clearly, but I remember it probably a case in Africa. The ruling class or the government will co-op with the oil company or the big conservation groups. So could you talk more about those kind of human rights related aspects of the problem?
Yeah, yeah, sure, and just keep it brief because it's been one of the main focuses of the work that I've been doing. But I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. In that one of the Cordillera Azul Park in Peru, it turns out that actually there's a fairly large group of indigenous people living in that area, or at least they were living in that area. And they've been there for thousands of years, basically, and have it claim it under their ancestral rights. When the area became designated as a national park in pursuit of this carbon project, they lost all of their territorial claims. Now they've got some of those back, but some of them are still, essentially kind of evicted to the outer edges of the park, and they're not getting any benefits back from the carbon project because they're simply not recognised as being, a part of the kind of ownership structure in the sense of the area. So it can have consequences such as that. And yes, you mentioned the tree planting scheme in the Republic of Congo. That's part of Total Oil's claims to becoming carbon neutral as it's planting this 40,000 hectare plantation there. Again, it's all land that's being used by local people and has been for a very long time, including, again, indigenous peoples there. So that land will now disappear under a sea of trees, essentially. I've actually, for most of the last year, been working on another case, in fact, in Kenya, where it's the biggest claimed carbon capture project in the world, supposedly claiming storing more carbon in the soil of an area of about 2 million hectares, what's that, half the size of Taiwan, in northern Kenya. And the way that they're doing this area's been inhabited by about 100,000 indigenous pastoralists of the Maasai-linked groups and Boranas, Samburas, and others, various indigenous groups there. And they've used these lands for grazing their cattle for, again, thousands of years under their traditional management regime. Well, it's now been claimed by a conservation organization. In fact, this has been happening for about 10 years now, that this is degrading the vegetation and therefore degrading the carbon. So if you stop these traditional grazing regimes then and replace it with kind of more kind of modernized form of kind of cattle ranching or cattle rearing, then you can improve the vegetation and improve the storage of soil carbon. And they've been selling millions of carbon credits from that project for the last few years, including to Netflix, Meta, Facebook, some of the large banking institutions. And the thing with this, it basically, it's completely fake as well. I mean, they aren't actually storing any more carbon there as far as anyone can see. But in order to try and do so, they have to essentially completely destroy or alter at least this very long-standing traditional indigenous regime of pastoralism. So again, we see an example exactly where the people who have, in a sense, lived closest to nature, have protected nature because they've always lived alongside wild animals there. They have very strict kind of traditional rules about protecting animals. They don't hunt them or eat them. And they almost had no carbon emissions whatsoever. They are the ones that are suffering most to create these carbon offsets to deal with the offsets of some of the biggest, and richest, and most polluting companies on the planet. It's extremely perverse. So yes, and this, but this is this is the nature of what we're seeing here. These kinds of projects need land, and they need a lot of land essentially. If it's storing carbon in the soil or planting more trees or whatever, you need a lot of land. Where is that land easiest to get hold of? Well, it's where land tenure often is weakest. It's where governments are more persuadable, let's say, or maybe corruptible. It's where the rights regimes are weakest, such as typically as of indigenous peoples, who often have the weakest protection of their rights. So these often are going to be the places that are first being targeted for these kinds of projects. And then when we move to biodiversity offsetting, which is coming, it's being developed at the moment, then the problem is going to become even worse, because there's a very strong correlation between indigenous peoples' existence and use of land and high levels of biodiversity. So those are going to be the very first places that are going to be targeted in these kind of biodiversity offsetting and trading schemes.
There's a problem. There's a question in the chat room. Coco asks, in this talk, you talked mostly about planting trees, but nature-based solutions also has to do with wetlands, and is it plants in the ocean plants or ocean vegetations? I'm not sure how to say it in English. And he or she asks, and also nature-based solutions also talks about in the cities or urban areas to reduce carbon. So he or she wonders if you can talk more about those.
I can talk about them, but not very much. I mean, but yes, they are definitely all included within what people are considering to be nature-based solutions. I think because essentially anything that's to do with living organisms with benefits for humanity can now be considered to be a nature-based solution. Another reason why I think the term should be dropped, because it's so general now. It's kind of reached the point of meaninglessness. But yes, so of course, yeah, planting trees in cities is good, and saving wetlands is generally good. But in the sense of which nature-based solutions is being used and kind of mobilized especially in the kind of global negotiations around climate, these are actually kind of irrelevant, because as that analysis that I showed earlier on points out, three quarters of the climate mitigating potential for nature-based solutions is related to trees, either planting new ones or saving the existing ones. So, what's left is a pretty small proportion. Wetlands are definitely a part of it. There are bits in there about, well, we can re-establish kelp forests in the seas, and they will also help store more carbon. We're talking about globally very, very small amounts of carbon. Less than 1% of the overall kind of nature-based solutions potential. I mean, not bad things to do in and of their own right, but if we think that these are going to solve the climate problem, they're not. Simple as that.
Samuel, do you want to ask your question? Because Samuel, he wrote, I'll just read what he wrote in the chat room. He writes, in theory, the answer is we cannot put a price on nature. So when asked what should we do we agitate to get these lands valued intrinsically as opposed to putting a price on them? If that's so, how can governments and corporations operate on this logic? Because in practice, they only understand price due to the neoliberal paradigm. Without price, things have no voice in our system, it seems. It seems we are at an impasse. Aren't societal movements the only way to give a voice to these things? So it's kind of a question, but not a question. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, well, to my mind, the answer, especially to the last part of that question, is yes. I mean, it's social movements that need to give voice to what can't actually be valued. I mean, and it's interesting, you know, I spent a lot of my professional life working with indigenous communities, and you know, some of whom have very, very large territories in the Amazon with billions and billions and billions of tons of carbon stored in them, and all kinds of the most biodiverse places on Earth. And almost without exception, I mean, there are one or two exceptions, almost without exception, there is no conception of the financial value ever expressed by them or tried to be monetized by them whatsoever. In fact, they kind of completely reject this commodification of nature and, you know, what some people would consider to be natural assets. I mean, to them, this is their, you know, their mother, you know, their spiritual homeland, the meaning of their life. It's where their ancestors are. It's everything, you know. It's everything apart from a financial value, actually. So yes, I mean, I think there can be a certain amount of romanticization of the kind of indigenous people's life, but I think there are things we learn from that. You know, we need to, you know, appreciate that there are values in our, you know, natural surroundings, whatever we consider that to be, that are beyond price. And yes, we can only defend those things through social activism, in a sense, through mobilization. You know, these are kind of political judgments that should not be made on the basis of some kind of completely fake you know, valuation of them to enable them to become assets tradable in the financial market. So I mean, a short yes, I agree with what Samuel is saying there.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? Okay. If not, what you just said was actually a very good way to end this lecture. I thank you for enlightening us on this relatively new concept, but I think to a lot of us, it's also a lot for us to reflect on. And even though it's kind of shocking and somewhat frustrating to know that the world is kind of not what we think it is, but that's precisely the reason that we must think even more carefully what we should do and should not do. So thank you so much, Simon, and thanks everyone for participating in this lecture. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, and thanks very much for having me along this afternoon.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye bye.